why are we here? There were perhaps up to 60,000 people who were executed for witchcraft in the preceding few centuries. You know, there were examples where in a rather short time period there were up to 1,000 people executed all over Europe. These trials were tiny, where you have 19 people being executed. So why are these world famous? One reason is these do come towards the end of this witch trial movement, and they were the biggest in American history. In the New World, this is the biggest example you can find. It's also a pretty manageable number. There's a quote that's attributed probably falsely to Stalin that one death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a statistic. So you have 20 deaths here, you can read about these people, you can learn their names, you can get a handle on 20 people being executed. 1,000 people, there's a part where it doesn't have as much resonance. Another reason is that people at the time understood that what was going on here was wrong. You had people speaking out against it even then. And you had efforts by the people in power to cover up what's going on here and what had gone on here so that people would know about it. And as often happens, I think there's a sense in which this effort to cover it up backfired and made these witch trials be more well known and more infamous. And the last reason, it's a great way to attack the Puritans. People don't like the theology of the Puritans, and this is the best example they can find as to why Puritanism was evil. And so it's an interesting and exciting story, so it gets talked about a lot. But I think as people who sympathize with Puritan theology, it's a good thing to study, it's a good thing to think about, a good thing to learn from. As in many ways, the theology of the people who are here executing witches was pretty sound. And so we should study it and make sure that we don't go wrong in the same way that they did. Salem Village had a bit of a reputation before these trials even took place. It was a contentious place. They had trouble finding and keeping ministers in the church. Twice in 20 years, they ended up in court with their pastor. That's something that today would be very unusual. Twice, with two different pastors over 20 years, they are in court. The people are reluctant to pay their pastor. So in the year 1692, Samuel Parris is the pastor. He had been there a little over a year, and of course we are standing in front of the foundation of his house. And he had come there only after extensive negotiation, monetary negotiation, how much he was going to be paid, where he was going to live, all these things. He had worked it out, whether it was because of his own motivations for getting into it, whether it was because of the reputation that Salem had, but he had been very careful to make sure that everything was squared away before getting involved. There are also some pretty severe religious tensions in the church over theology. A lot of this was over the halfway covenant. When Parris comes to Salem, he rolls back the halfway covenant. It had been adopted as a church that they were going to bring in or baptize into membership the children of people whose parents were not members of the church. He eliminates that and will no longer baptize these children. So the problems begin, the witchcraft problems begin here in Parris's own house, the house of the pastor. And it begins with two young women or girls, with his daughter, Betty, who is age 9, and his niece, Abigail, who is age 11. And they began to experience some strange symptoms, some things that the doctors didn't recognize. And so they consult the doctors and they say this is supernatural. To summarize it, they were saying that they were being physically tormented by someone who wasn't there, who they couldn't see. So let's just talk about the mindset of the people at this time. At the time, virtually everyone believed in witches, they believed in demons. They believed in a supernatural world. And they had a lot of specific ideas about how that was manifest. They believed that witches were people who had made a covenant with the devil, and that those witches then went on to torment other people. People sometimes who were in their presence, sometimes who were not in their presence. They thought there were marks on the skin whereby you could identify a witch. There were a lot of patterns and motifs of witchcraft. Things like the idea that a witch could not say the Lord's Prayer. They could not say those words. And they had a big list of things that how to identify a witch, things that you do not find in Scripture. When the Scripture talks about witches, but it does not include all these marks of a witch that they were operating off of and that they were executing people based on. Another big thing at the time was counter magic or good magic. Spells or recipes or certain things you did, different superstitions to ward off evil spirits or to ward off witches. Now, good magic was condemned by the Puritans by and large. This is not something that they supported, but it was something that went on because even though this was nominally a Puritan society, there were a lot of people here who didn't follow everything the pastor said. And it seemed to me like there was more of this superstition than there is today, at least in certain ways. I mean, we have our own superstitions, but the particular physical things that they were superstitious of, I think it was more common at that time. So you have these two young girls. You have things happening to them that people can't explain. The doctors say it's supernatural. So there was a neighbor, Mary Sibley, and she recommended that they use this counter magic that I was just describing. She was a church member and she wanted to figure out what was happening to these girls and what witch in their community was tormenting them. And so there were two servants that Paris had in his home. So these were likely from Barbados. His father had had a plantation there from the Caribbean. And so he has these two servants, Tituba and John Indian. Well, they performed this quote-unquote good magic. And Sibley ends up confessing to what she had done, that she had recommended that this magic be used and participated in it. Tituba confessed as well, though she denied being an actual witch. So this is an important moment in the story of the witchcraft trials, because they know now that witchcraft and magic is real in Salem. At a bare minimum, there had been this attempt to figure out who a witch was, but that attempt using magic is witchcraft. 3 people have been discovered practicing witchcraft. They had confessed, and what happens is there's no consequences to any of these 3 people. Sibley was publicly rebuking the church, but Paris says, oh, she did it ignorantly. But he does condemn this in the church, saying that you cannot be going to the devil for help against the devil. But this is where things are going to be wrong, because if we're going to punish people for witchcraft, here's your opportunity. Here's people who have confessed to practicing witchcraft and nothing really happened to them. And as we go through the rest of the story, there's a pattern. The numbers are very clear. No one who confessed was executed. On the other hand, everyone who was tried and refused to confess was executed, except for one man, Samuel Wardwell, who made a confession, retracted it, and was executed. And that includes one man who died while they were trying to force a confession. So this was not necessarily their plan, because as we're going to hear, these trials were cut short by the government, and it is very likely that those who confessed would have been executed eventually anyway for the witchcraft, because that confession didn't mean that they wouldn't be held to account. But the reality was, for the people involved in these trials, you look at what is happening and you see, if you refuse to confess, you get executed. If you confess and say, oh, I can tell you some other people who are also witches, you're gonna live a little bit longer, perhaps you're gonna survive, as that happened. That gives an obvious motivation for people to falsely confess. Even people who knew they were innocent, even people who knew that others they were accusing were innocent, they are seeing they can save their life by confessing, because they confessed and it did save their life. The judges were encouraging them to accuse others, and it worked for every single one of them. You have one supposed witch who is condemned to death. They then confess, and their execution is delayed, and eventually they're not executed. So when you see things like that happening in your community, the motivation is super obvious. If you want to survive, confess to witchcraft. So going back to what's happening here, to these girls that are afflicted, these mysterious afflictions begin to spread. And the sufferers begin to accuse particular people, including Tituba, the servant of Paris, the pastor. She's arrested. She confesses to witchcraft. And confessed not just to this quote-unquote good magic that she said before. Now she's saying, yes, I'm a witch, I'm in contract with the devil, all of these things. They go on to investigate others, to arrest them, and obtain confessions from them. So why would people falsely confess to witchcraft, apart from that, the later motivation they have, knowing that you can get off and not be executed? Why would people falsely confess? So if you look into it, even today, people falsely confess all the time. If pressure is put on them by authorities, they can testify things that at first might seem impossible for them to know, because the investigators, the people looking into it, questioning them, can feed them information. Sometimes unwittingly, they can actually feed them information, and then the information gets parroted back and gets confirmed when they're right and denied when they're wrong. So it ends up where they write out their confession, and it seems like, how they even know these things? How are they confessing all this stuff? In fact, they may have had nothing to do with it entirely. 29% of DNA exonerations in the United States, which is about as foolproof as you can get, where the DNA of the criminal is left on the scene, someone confessed, and then later they go back and test it once they have the technology and they realize, oh, it was someone entirely different who did it. So 29% of those cases where the false person had been convicted in our courts, that included a false confession. So about a third of the time, the person confessed falsely. The same thing that happens in America today, in the last few decades, same thing was happening back in the 1600s. People are the same elements influence people, the same elements affect people, and so you have people falsely confessing to witchcraft, just like people falsely confess to all manner of crimes today. So the Puritan leaders, Paris and the other people, they are taking this very seriously. They want to do this right. They consult with theologians, with other people. They study books that have been published on the subject of witchcraft. They're not going into this, trigger happy, necessarily wanting to execute people. But that didn't mean that their approach wasn't completely wrong and completely on the wrong basis. Looking back with hindsight, we can see the areas where they went wrong, and we can see that this was a mass hysteria, which there's a lot of interesting examples that have taken place, that aren't witchcraft related, where just strange diseases can go through societies and can begin to affect people when there's not a physical cause, where there was a physical cause in one instance, but other people hear what's going on and end up having the same symptoms, but it's only caused by their mind. Hundreds of years later, we can't know exactly what was going on in Salem. We can't know how much true witchcraft there was and how much demonic activity there may have been, but we can know that a lot of this stuff were false accusations, and there were a lot of things that were done wrongly, and we can definitely learn from that. We're here at the Old Burying Point in Salem, one of the oldest graveyards in America. I'm going to pick up the story of the Salem Witch Trials here. Some of the people involved in this trial are buried in this graveyard. So we go to the end of March 1692. We have all these accusations beginning, starting in the Paris household, the pastor in Salem, and spreading to other people. People saying they're having all these symptoms and that people are cursing them, witches are cursing them. So people begin to be arrested. Eventually this is going to rise up so that over 100 people were arrested for witchcraft in Salem. So May 27th, the governor finally responds, and he establishes what's called the Court of Oyer and Terminer. That is Old French. It comes from an Old French phrase meaning hear and determine. So this is the court that's supposed to decide all these cases, a special court, composed of prominent citizens, including John Hawthorne, ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Nathaniel Hawthorne is a famous novelist in Salem, one of the most famous novelists in all of American history, and his novels are going to contain a lot of anti-Puritan themes. Another one of the judges is Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, so he's pretty powerful in Massachusetts. And another one is Samuel Sewall. He is pretty famous. He wrote a famous diary from that time. So as they're deciding how they're going to handle this situation that they have with all these people in jail for witchcraft, is that they decide they're going to allow what was called spectral evidence. And this is a momentous and a controversial decision. Spectral evidence means that that if someone says, I am being tormented by someone's spirit, that can be used as evidence that that person is committing witchcraft, the person they're accusing of haunting them. So it's evidence that is just determined by someone saying that something spiritual is happening to them, and not any physical witness or anything of that nature to it actually happening. One of the major criticisms of spectral evidence from the time is that, okay, so assuming that this person is being honest, that they saw someone coming to haunt them and torment them. But how do you know that this is actually true? Scripture says that demons disguise themselves as angels of light. Couldn't a demon disguise himself as some upstanding person and then put the blame for this torment on that person? So that's one of the major things. Can you trust what people see in a vision? Could they have been deceived, even if the vision actually happened? So they end up accepting this evidence. It is a very unusual standard of evidence even for the time. Even the same judges that were on this court, they had used different standards of evidence, higher standards at other times. And this is one reason why people end up calling it a hysteria, is that because this really bad thing is happening, all these people being tormented, they're going to lower their standards and say, we just have to get people convicted and change our standards of evidence to do it. One of the reasons that the trials come to an end is that eventually, after people are executed, they decide to reject spectral evidence, and that greatly reduces the number of accusations and number of convictions. So, of course, spectral evidence poses big problems, because how do you disprove a false accusation? Imagine today if spectral evidence could be used to convict people. You would have thousands of people accusing any leading person of haunting them. You know, Trump, Biden, all these people would be being accused of witchcraft. So if you're going to accept it, you're going to have to deal with that, because you have all these witnesses. You'd have thousands of witnesses saying these people need to be executed. That actually happened at that time. But what they did is, when people accused people that were too prominent and too influential in society, they would say, well, they must be mistaken, we're not going to pursue that person as a witch. So even then, they had to deal with that problem, and their standard was not consistent, saying that all evidence needs to be weighed equally. It was if you were using spectral evidence against someone who, well, you know, yeah, they kind of seem like a witch, it could be used against them, but not against someone who was powerful in society. The more people who are arrested for witchcraft, the more people confess and begin to accuse others. The more people complaining of being tormented by other witches. You have people where they say they're being tormented, and then they accuse someone, that person's arrested, that person's even executed, and then suddenly that person is still tormented, but now it's by someone else, and the process continues. So the court runs from May until October 29th, when the governor dissolves it and realized that because it had been realized that what was happening was wrong. Some prisoners were released immediately, more arrests are forbidden, and another court ended up convicting 3 more women of witchcraft, but they are pardoned by the governor. By that time, 22 people had been convicted of witchcraft. 14 women were executed and 5 men. 5 others died in jail, although not convicted. More had been sentenced to death but were not executed because the trials were put to an end.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and share it with your friends. You can also visit www.discerninghistory.com for more videos and other resources.